I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, steam still hanging in the air from the hot shower, as I tried to focus on the upcoming interview. It was the job I had always dreamed of, and I rehearsed my answers, working to steady the slight tremor in my voice. Just as I began to feel more confident, a gentle knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. "Daniel, are you in there?" Though Emily's tone was soft, there was an unusual quality to it that I couldn't quite identify. "Yes, Emily?" I replied, slightly puzzled but attempting to sound calm, as if nothing were amiss. "I'm just getting ready for the interview." After a brief pause, she responded, "Sorry to bother you, but I need to grab something from the bathroom. Is that okay?" "No problem. Come in," I said, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. Emily had always been considerate and polite. What could possibly go wrong in such a routine situation? When the door opened slightly, I caught a glimpse of her silhouette from the corner of my eye. She was wearing her bathrobe, but this time it appeared a bit looser than usual. I kept my gaze fixed on the mirror, wiping the steam from its surface as I tried to ignore her presence. She quietly walked to the cabinet, but in an instant, she was standing directly in front of me, and that's when it happened. "Oh, God," Emily managed to whisper, her face turning crimson. While I stood frozen, unable to utter a word, my heart raced in my chest, feeling as if it might burst. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said, avoiding my eyes. There was a note of something unfamiliar in her voice, an uneasy mix of embarrassment and something deeper, leaving me feeling more bewildered. My mind was spinning. This was a pivotal moment that would separate our lives into before and after. The next morning, I awoke feeling shattered. The bathroom incident replayed in my mind, refusing to let go. I spent the day attempting to regain my usual rhythm, but everything felt foggy. Even the meticulously prepared interview passed in a blur, as I responded to questions like a robot, barely registering what the interviewers said. My thoughts kept looping back to the same images. Her face, her look of embarrassment, and of course, the moment when her robe slipped open. Emily acted as if nothing had happened. There were no awkward hints, no signs of embarrassment on her face. Yet, each time our eyes met, I felt something ignite inside me, a feeling I tried to suppress. Was it truly an accident? Or was there something more between us in that moment? I resolved to distract myself that evening after work, so I left the house for a walk around the neighborhood. I aimed to clear my head, but each step brought me back to that morning. I couldn't explain it. I felt ashamed of my thoughts, ashamed that I could even think of Emily in that way. But the more I tried to forget, the stronger the feeling became. Frightened me. Upon returning home, I found Emily in the kitchen, standing by the stove, cooking dinner. Out of habit, I leaned in to say a few words. My thoughts whirled, and I sensed the tension growing between us with each moment that passed. "How was the interview?" she asked, smiling as usual, but her eyes seemed different to me. "Fine," I replied tersely, not wanting to delve into details. My response felt somewhat abrupt, but I was unsure how else to navigate the situation. We had dinner in silence with my father. Everything around us felt normal. Yet inside me, a storm was brewing. I knew something had shifted between Emily and me, even if we both tried to pretend otherwise. Later that night, just as I was settling down for sleep, I heard a gentle knock on my door. It was Emily. She stepped in quietly, closing the door behind her, and paused for a moment at the threshold. "Daniel, we need to talk." Her voice was soft, but there was an uncertainty about it. My mind raced with possibilities of what she might say. It was clear she wanted to address the bathroom incident, but I hoped it might be just an awkward moment we could dismiss. Emily moved closer and sat at the edge of the bed. We both sat in silence, searching for the right words. She looked at me, and I sensed this conversation would change everything. "What happened?" she started, but I quickly interrupted. "It was an accident, Emily. There's no need to dwell on it." I tried to ease the tension, but she continued to look at me, and I felt the situation slipping beyond my control. "It wasn't just an accident," she finally whispered, her voice shaking. "I can't ignore what I feel." In that instant, I understood we were teetering on the edge of something inexplicable, something that couldn't easily be forgotten. The following morning, I was awakened by bright sunlight streaming through the curtains. My head felt heavy, as if I hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous night echoed in my mind, leaving me restless. Emily had said something I never expected, though perhaps I simply didn't want to admit it. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts assaulted me from all angles. What did it mean? What would happen now? Every time I recalled her words, a tightening sensation gripped my insides. She mentioned that she couldn't ignore her feelings, but what did that imply for us? Regarding my father, I felt an odd urge to disappear, to leave and go back to college, to forget everything like it had been a bad dream. But I knew that running away wasn't the answer. I couldn't just leave home without understanding what was truly happening. I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, where I found a note from Emily on the table. Her handwriting was familiar, neat, and composed. "Daniel, we need to talk. I want you to know that you're not to blame for what happened." "I'll be in the kitchen later," Emily wrote. My heart started racing again. Why did that sound so formal? It felt as if she wanted to put the topic to rest once and for all. Maybe that was the right approach, just pretend nothing had happened. But could I really let it go? Could I erase it from my memory? I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. I needed to clear my head and give myself some time to think before facing Emily again. I headed to the nearest park where I often liked to take walks. The fresh, cool air felt as if nature was trying to soothe me, but my thoughts kept swirling, preventing me from finding any peace. I couldn't stop replaying her words in my mind. "I can't ignore what I feel." Those words weighed heavily on me, especially considering our relationship. Emily, my stepmother. I had known her for years and never imagined anything like this could happen between us. To me, she had always been part of the family, someone who came into my father's life and offered support. But now, every step I took through the park felt different. I sank deeper into my thoughts, trying to figure out what I was feeling. Was it simply embarrassment over what had happened in the bathroom? Or was there something more? Something I wasn't ready to acknowledge? I sat down on a bench, leaning forward with my face buried in my hands. My mind felt chaotic, and I longed for everything to be simpler, to return to the normal life I once knew. But now, I was teetering on the edge of something that could potentially destroy everything. After nearly an hour in the park, I finally resolved to go home. As much as I wanted to avoid the conversation, it was unavoidable. Emily was clearly waiting to discuss where we stood. We couldn't just ignore what had happened. When I returned home, the kitchen was quiet. Emily sat at the table, a cup of coffee in front of her that she seemed to have forgotten about. She appeared lost in thought, her face betraying signs of tension. As I approached the table, she looked up at me, and I noticed something new in her eyes. Perhaps fatigue, sadness, or doubt. "Hi," I said, trying to mask the nervousness in my voice. "Hi," she replied, and an awkward silence settled between us, one neither of us knew how to break. I took a seat across from her, and for a few moments, we simply stared at each other until she finally spoke. "Daniel, I've been thinking a lot about this, about what happened. I never intended for things to go this far." "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already had a sense of the answer. She sighed, as if preparing herself for a difficult conversation, and continued. "I know it was unexpected, and maybe it made you uncomfortable, but I can't ignore what I feel. I think you know that too." Her words lingered in the air, leaving me speechless. Yes, I felt it too, but it felt wrong. I couldn't allow myself to entertain those thoughts. Yet how could I disregard what had transpired between us? "I don't know what to say," I finally managed to utter. "This is all so strange." She leaned forward, her eyes softening. "I know, Daniel, and I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now, but we need to be honest with each other. This isn't something that just vanish." I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my throat. I sat there, feeling the tension building inside me. We both understood that this conversation wouldn't resolve everything, yet we could no longer remain silent. Emily reached out and gently squeezed my hand. The simplicity of her touch carried the weight of our complex situation. I felt the warmth of her palm, and it was both comforting and troubling. "You know, I don't want to hurt your father," she said quietly, her voice trembling as she tried to maintain her composure. "Of course," I replied, feeling my heart tighten. "I don't want to hurt him either." But deep down, I knew we had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We sat in silence for what felt like ages, neither of us deigning to make the next move. This moment hung in the balance, poised on the edge of a decision that could alter our lives forever. Later that evening, when I returned home, the kitchen was still quiet. My father hadn't yet returned from work, and Emily stood by the stove, preparing dinner. The aroma of fried chicken filled the room, and on any other day, it would have whetted my appetite. But today was different. I approached her slowly, acutely aware of the invisible tension that hung between us. We hadn't spoken since she revealed her feelings, and the silence was becoming unbearable. It felt as if every action we took was heavy with the weight of what we were both trying to suppress. "How was your day?" Emily asked, attempting to sound casual as if everything was normal. However, her voice quivered slightly, betraying her effort to remain calm. "Fine," I replied shortly, avoiding eye contact. I felt that any interaction between us could tip the scales of this mounting tension. Dinner passed in an awkward silence, one of those moments where words stuck in our throats, and no matter how hard we tried to act naturally, everything felt forced. I was caught between a desire to flee and a need to figure out what was happening. Emily seemed lost in her own thoughts too, and I knew we couldn't keep pretending this wasn't an issue. Finally, once our plates were empty, she set down her fork and looked at me. "We can't go on like this," she said softly, as if reading my mind. I met her gaze, realizing that this conversation was unavoidable. We couldn't continue avoiding the heavy weight that loomed over us. "You're right," I admitted, and the words felt significant, more than just an acknowledgement. I don't know what to do about it, Daniel." She looked perplexed, as if confronting a problem without a clear solution. "It's wrong. I know that," I said, feeling the weight of it all. "But I can't shake these thoughts. It feels like you can't either." I didn't know how to respond, so I fell silent. My feelings for Emily felt like a transgression of every moral boundary I held dear. Yet, denying those feelings was equally impossible. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a soft whisper. "What's on your mind about all of this?" I swallowed hard, feeling the conflict within me intensify. "I don't know," I managed to say. "I realize it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about it." Her expression softened, revealing something I hadn't seen before. A blend of sadness and yearning. "Me too," she whispered. Before I knew it, she was beside me again. Her hand grazed mine, and suddenly the barrier we had carefully erected over the past few days crumbled. That touch stirred something deep within me, and I couldn't resist it. This moment felt different, not like last time. It was charged with all the unspoken feelings and thoughts we had both tried to stifle. When her lips brushed against mine, it felt as if everything inside me shattered. This was no mere lapse in judgment. It was the moment we both recognized that there was no turning back. The kiss lasted only a fleeting moment, but it was enough to transform everything. I was the first to pull away, my heart racing wildly. "Emily," I began, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess, leaving me at a loss for words. She stepped back, lowering her gaze as if she were ashamed of what had just transpired. "I'm sorry," she murmured, but there was an undercurrent in her voice, a sense that this wasn't the end, but rather the beginning of something we could no longer manage. I stood there, unsure how to deal with this new and unsettling feeling. I don't know how we can resolve this." My words sounded confused and powerless because, honestly, I had no idea what to do. Emily nodded, yet remained silent. We both recognized that we had crossed a line, venturing down a path without any clear sense of direction. As I left the kitchen, it felt as though my entire world had flipped upside down. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house felt deceptively calm, like the quiet before a storm. My father had already left for work, leaving just Emily and me alone. I was overwhelmed by a surge of emotions that I couldn't contain, and this profound sense of uncertainty gnawed at me. We both avoided each other throughout the day, each of us clearly afraid of what would happen if we crossed paths. But by evening, I realized there was no longer a way to escape the inevitable. I stepped out onto the porch to take a breath of fresh air and try to clear my mind. The sun was setting, casting soft hues of orange and pink across the sky. The street was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I took a deep breath, hoping to calm the storm inside my head, but it didn't help. A little while later, Emily stepped out onto the porch. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. We stood in silence for what felt like ages, watching the sun dip below the horizon. What once felt like a comfortable silence was now charged with awkwardness and tension. "We need to talk," Emily finally said, her voice quiet yet firm. I looked at her, waiting for her to elaborate, though I had an inkling of what she was about to say. "Daniel, I can't ignore what happened between us," she continued, maintaining her gaze on me. "I don't know how to deal with it, but I can't just act like it didn't happen." Her words were a confession of what I had been sensing all along but had been too afraid to articulate. Our silence, our kiss, everything had spoken for us. We had ventured too far to return to the way things were. "I can't forget it either," I confessed, unable to keep my silence any longer. My heart raced so fast it felt as if it would burst. "But this is wrong, Emily. This isn't something that should have happened." She nodded slowly, her eyes darkening with the weight of unspoken emotions. "I know," she whispered, "but that doesn't make it any easier." We both understood that we were teetering on the brink of something that could unravel everything around us. The scariest part was that I had no idea how to put a stop to it. Everything I felt for Emily was genuine, yet completely misguided at the same time. "What are we going to do?" I asked, desperately hoping she would have an answer to this painful dilemma. Emily lowered her gaze, as if searching for the words she needed. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice thick with restrained feelings. "But I don't want to hurt your father. I can't live with that." Her words hit me like a blow. I knew she was right. My father didn't deserve this. He was significant to both of us, and betraying him would be catastrophic. But how could I go on pretending that nothing had happened? How could we act like everything was normal? "We can't just forget about this," I finally said. "Emily, I don't know how to stop thinking about it, but I don't want to ruin our lives." Our eyes met, and I saw the same turmoil reflected in her gaze. "I can't either," she said softly. We both fell silent, unsure of how to escape this impossible situation. Each word we exchanged only widened the gap between our reality and what we truly felt. I sensed that everything we had known was slowly disintegrating. Suddenly, Emily took a cautious step closer. Her movements were deliberate, as if she were still deciding her next move. But there was something undeniable in her eyes, a longing she couldn't suppress, just as I couldn't. She reached out, taking my hand in hers. The warmth of her skin sent a jolt through me, reigniting everything I had desperately tried to ignore. I looked into her eyes, and we shared a moment of silent understanding. "Emily," I started, but I didn't have the chance to finish. She leaned in again, and our lips met once more. This kiss was different, more intense and charged with all the unspoken words we had been too afraid to express. It lingered longer, filled with pain and desire, and I found myself unable to pull away. We both knew we had crossed a significant line, but there was no stopping now. This moment encapsulated everything we had tried to deny and ignore. It was now unavoidable. Reality faded into the background, leaving just the two of us and our feelings, which we could no longer contain. When the kiss finally ended, we were both left breathless, the weight of our unacknowledged emotions hanging heavily in the air. Realizing what we had done, I was in disbelief, but everything had changed. "We can't keep doing this," I said, struggling to maintain my composure. "I know," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper, as soft as the breeze. In that moment, I understood that there was no going back. We had crossed a line, and our lives would never be the same again. When my father came home that evening, everything seemed perfectly normal. The evening unfolded in its usual quietness, filled with the familiar sounds of life, the hum of the TV in the living room, the soft clinking of cutlery against plates at dinner. It felt as if nothing had altered, but I knew that was just a facade. Emily and I hadn't addressed what had transpired on the porch. We both understood that this wasn't the time or place for such a conversation, especially with my father around. She seamlessly slipped back into the role of the perfect wife, smiling warmly as if everything was unchanged. But each time our eyes met, a tightness gripped my chest. We couldn't keep pretending, yet we had to continue acting our parts. The internal tension was almost unbearable. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, but my mind kept returning to Emily. This emotional turmoil offered no peace. We had gone too far to simply forget, yet circumstances trapped us, preventing any progress. My father remained oblivious, living his daily routine, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface, something that could shatter everything he cherished. At times, I felt like I was betraying him with every glance at Emily, with every moment of silence that passed when she walked by. That evening, I stepped outside to get some air. The night was dark, illuminated only by the streetlights casting a dim glow along the road. The cool air filled my lungs as I took a deep breath, hoping it would ease the weight pressing down on me. But the calm never arrived. Everything that had occurred, everything I felt, was like a burden I couldn't shake. Shortly after, Emily emerged from the house. I heard the door click shut behind her as she approached. We stood in silence for a few moments, both lost in our thoughts. It was clear that we shared the same heaviness and inner turmoil. "Daniel," she said softly, breaking the silence, "we can't keep going like this. It's tearing me apart." I looked into her eyes and saw the pain mirrored in my own. We both knew that something had to change, yet neither of us knew how to initiate that change. Standing there, I could feel the tension radiating between us, palpable and stifling. Emily's words echoed in my mind. "We can't keep going like this." I understood all too well that she was right. This tension was suffocating us. But what could we do? How could we navigate a situation where every step we took could lead to disaster? She sighed and looked away, searching for something in the darkness, before turning back to me. "I've been thinking about it, Daniel," she finally said. Her voice was quiet, yet there was a newfound determination in it. "We need to stop. We have to give ourselves time to figure out what we truly want." I listened intently, feeling a flicker of hope stirring within me. This pause, this time apart, sounded like our only chance to save ourselves from the situation we had fallen into. We had gone too far, and the only way to avoid complete disaster was to take a step back. "You're right," I managed to reply, despite the doubts still swirling in my mind. "We need time to make sense of all this." Emily nodded, though sadness lingered in her eyes. We both understood that this break might not resolve everything. It felt like we were simply delaying the inevitable. But we had to do something. There was no other option. "Let's take this time," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "No pressure. No need to figure it all out right now." I nodded again, although the doubts continued to churn within me. We couldn't let this continue, but stopping felt just as impossible. When Emily and I returned to the house, it was as if nothing had happened. Time seemed to drag, and each step I took echoed loudly in my mind. My father was already asleep, and the silence enveloping the house only intensified the tension between us. I went to my room, but sleep eluded me. Everything we had discussed replayed in my thoughts. Pause time. How could that possibly help when everything had already spiraled so far out of control? I tried to convince myself that this decision was wise, that it might offer us both a chance to heal. But deep down, I sensed I was only fooling myself. After what felt like hours, I heard a soft knock at my door. "Emily." My heart tightened at the realization that she had returned. I opened the door to find her standing there in the dim hallway light, her eyes filled with emotions. Those same feelings we had both been trying to suppress. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't live like this, Daniel." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. We had just agreed to take time apart, yet her gaze told me that no amount of time would change what had already happened between us. Emily stepped closer, and I felt the walls I had erected begin to crumble. "No matter what we try to do, this won't stop," she breathed. In that moment, I realized she was right. We had gone too far. All our discussions about taking a pause, about figuring things out, they were just ways to postpone the inevitable, and I didn't know how to cope with that reality. Silence enveloped us again. We stood there facing each other, and I understood that this moment would change everything. But what could we do? Retreating was out of the question. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words escaped me. Suddenly, she turned and walked back into the darkness of the hallway. Only then did I realize that there was no turning back.